text instead of doing that. A couple of things to comment on with respect to macroeconomic events and some other things as well. The Federal Reserve Board, which we'll be discussing in the third section of the course, when we talk about the money and banking and monetary policy part of the course. The Federal Reserve had a meeting yesterday and today. They have already at 2 o'clock, or somewhere shortly thereafter, will announce their policy statement. The expectation is that there will not be any change in their policy for this month, but they do meet again in December. The Fed, as we will see, there's an attempt to try to separate out monetary policy from political influence. Changing interest rate policy at this point in the election cycle would be controversial. If they were to make any type of change today, it would be highly unprecedented. December is a different story. The election will have been completed by then, whatever the outcome, and it's likely, as most experts think, that the Fed will have some type of policy adjustment in December, depending upon data, depending upon what the data shows. There's an article in this morning's Wall Street Journal. The Fed holds to its 2% target for inflation. That's what it is shooting for. It's also a concern that if the macroeconomy starts to deteriorate a bit, there's an employment report this Friday, the Fed may change that approach. So let's just say if the decisions are data-driven, depends on what the data tells us. There's also a suggestion right now as the economy is performing somewhat of it's in a muddled position. There's some signs that indicate the economy will continue to grow, some more puzzling signs. There's an article in the New York Times yesterday, says titled, "Sales Down, Hiring Slow, Let's All Blame the Election." That the uncertainties associated with the presidential election are having a negative effect on the economy. It's a wonderful thing to hear people say. What this article refers to are the studies that have been done during every presidential election cycle, and the data don't bear it out. All right, so it's, again, analysis by anecdote, a little story that people like to tell, but not something that actual analysis suggests has a major impact on the performance of the macro economy. Financial markets, a different story. Financial markets are much more sensitive and volatile, but the performance of the economy itself, sometimes I think when performance is not particularly good, there's an attempt to try to look for excuses. The article I thought was quite interesting that was in the New York Times yesterday, titled, "Paid Sick Leave Has a Cost, but So Does Not Offering It." It's about 40% of workers, 45% of workers in the United States currently do not have access to any type of paid sick leave. And there's an argument in some states, for example, Connecticut has mandated it. And the argument is that this increases the cost of doing business and ultimately probably results in lower hourly wage rates, ceteris paribus, for workers in exchange for that paid sick leave compensation. The article that's in the Times is a very good one because it points out that, like everything else, there are pluses and minuses associated with this. And what it suggests, for example, is that when paid sick leave is available, when statistical tests are done in areas where paid sick leave is available, actually you get more hours worked. Because if people who are sick don't come to work, that means what? That the people who are at work don't get sick. Not everybody, but there's enough of an impact where we call it in economics, and you're not responsible for this, a positive externality, a positive external benefit. It's like getting vaccinated. If everyone in this room is considering getting a vaccine for the flu, and only half of us get it, is there a benefit to the other half that it's less likely that the flu will be spread throughout the room? Yes. So there's a positive externality. For every action an individual gets involved in for vaccinations, they reduce the likelihood of other people who don't get the vaccination of contracting the illness. So the argument would apply here in the context of paid sick leave. Yes, there's an out-of-pocket expense associated with it, but the benefits down the road may actually outweigh those costs. If fewer people are getting sick, if fewer people are getting the flu, then in fact we will have more hours worked, not less, as a result of the paid sick leave. Does it make any sense? Okay. In addition to that, we find other things happen. If people show up for work when they're ill and they're using heavy machinery, there's a greater probability of injury at work, and missing digits, whatever it is. Okay, that when you've got people who are sick trying to still attend to work, you're going to have a greater incidence of injuries on the job. Therefore, there's another positive benefit. We are oftentimes ignore these types of things because they're harder to see and harder to quantify. But quite often, like with vaccinations, they have a very positive impact in terms of not only the individual who gets the vaccination, but also the individuals who, as a result of that, don't get the illness themselves, even if they don't get the vaccination. Think about the effects of this. If we were a closed society in here, and let's say we had 140 people, and 139 people get the vaccination, that one person who didn't get it, do they have a benefit associated with it? Because if it's a closed society and we've got 140 people and 139 get the vaccination, the one who doesn't get it is not going to get ill. Because no one else in the room, and it varies obviously as we reduce the numbers, the probability of the risk goes up, but it's about risk assessment. And it really is something to keep in mind, again, a subtlety that we don't like these days. We like, we want to have our political slogans that we use that are simplistic in nature. But at the same time, when we start looking at the nuances and subtleties, it gives us a little more information. Similarly, an op-ed in the Wall Street, actually an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning, about the number of states that have the legalization of marijuana on the ballot this election. Maine, I think Massachusetts, right? Yep. Currently it's legal in what, Colorado, Washington, Oregon. California has it on the ballot. And the Wall Street Journal points out, okay, there are all kinds of reasons why you can make an argument for this, but there were some interesting statistics about what's happened in Colorado and some of the other states where marijuana has been legalized. Positive workplace drug tests for marijuana have increased 178% since 2012. Okay? Marijuana-related drug arrests, not for possessing marijuana, but for the activities one gets engaged in while under the influence, have soared 58% in states where marijuana has been legalized. Traffic deaths, marijuana-related traffic deaths have doubled in Washington, increased by a third in Colorado. Now, again, there tends to be a lot of jokes made about this, and you certainly could say the same thing about alcohol, couldn't you? All right, there are probably, you could do studies and tests that would show what the statistics are related to behaviors under the influence of alcohol. But when we look at these things, we tend to say, well, there's an economic benefit, people should have freedom of choice in order to engage in this, but in this case, is there an externality, but this time negative, that's imposed on other people? No? Not at all? If I'm driving down the street and somebody who's been smoking a joint whacks into me, there's not a negative effect on me?
He's been a bad driver.
We know how he's going to vote. In fact, maybe he's already sampled. In any event, the point here is that there are negative side effects that influence other people, and we don't always take these into consideration. And yes, you can say the same thing as we do about drunken driving and about behaviors under the influence of alcohol. But when we get wrapped up in the freedom of choice, the liberalization of our laws, it's important sometimes to think about what the other side, the flip side is. I'm not advocating for or against the legalization of marijuana. It is more a statement about, again, looking and considering the other aspects of the issue, the other factors associated with it, just like paid sick leave, just like anything else that we investigate. All right, so I don't want to get into the political discussion. Normally I would this time of year, and take a portion of a class and talk about the political platforms and the economic proposals of the candidates. And this time of year I'm not. For the first time in my career, I'm not doing it. You know why? Because no one cares. It's all about, sexual activity and emails and violation of, the things that we're talking about this time around are shocking for their lack of substance, and I'll just leave it at that. So we'll move on. Plus, to make any kind of comment at a time like this about particular candidates, one way or the other, seems to have much more of a explosive feature to it, given people's reactions. So there we go. And I'm not going to talk about religion either. We'll leave those off the table. It's a joke. They say that if you want to have a successful Thanksgiving, don't talk about politics or religion. Has anyone ever heard this? Okay. Get the family together and have dinner. best thing to do. In any event, the election will be over by Thanksgiving. The debate will not. Either way, somebody's going to say it was rigged. It was rigged by the powers that be. It was rigged by the FBI. You know, it's a horribly discouraging set of events this time around. Or I'm just getting old. Could be both. Not mutually exclusive. I think it's both. I am getting old?
No.
This is nice. What's your name again? Exam coming up next week? You know, there are consequences. Okay. Getting old. All right. You have an exam next Wednesday. This should not be news to you. I got an email from someone, thought it was today. Come to class, please. Okay. Your exam is next Wednesday, November 9th at 2 o'clock in Engelman C-112. Be there early. Be there early so we're ready to go at 2. Don't come drifting in like you're the king of the party. Right at 2 o'clock, everybody's waiting for you because you're special. No, get there early. Sit every other seat, same rules, we'll go over them again on Monday. You're going to be responsible, and we will finish the material today if I would shut up and get started on it. You are responsible for what we have covered from chapters 5, 6, and 7 in the first 2 pages of chapter 8. Fair enough? All right, let's go back then, back in time, to where we were on Monday, when we were talking about sources of inflation. And we had discussed demand pull inflation, and we were in the process of talking about cost push inflation. So our second source of inflation was cost push inflation. And we had already talked about the supply shock variant, and we were in the process of discussing the wage push variant. The wage push variant. And I had, yes?
Which chapter is this?
Well, we're dealing, this discussion of inflation, I believe, is in chapter 7.
Take it.
We had put up on the board a diagram where we have expanded our notion of supply and demand and applying it to a particular good, like good X in our typical examples. We have expanded it to talk about supply and demand for the macro economy as a whole. Please put the cell phone down, up and back. And in doing so, and I talked about this last time, and I'll do a quick review, we're measuring the price level on the vertical axis and GDP, or the level of output, on the horizontal axis. And we said that our supply function now, again, this is review for those of you who weren't here, we're expanding to talk not just about supply for a particular good, but the aggregate supply of all goods and services. We'll call it AS1. And our demand function now is aggregate demand. Our demand function applied for all goods and services, which we had labeled AD, or aggregate demand, AD subscript 1. We have an equilibrium position. That initial equilibrium position is at a price level PL1, and a level of output we will call GDP1. And what we discussed at the end of class is that when we get cost push inflation, it's inflation due to an increase in the cost of production. If we go back to our discussion of supply, when we get an increase in input prices, an increase in the cost of production, ceteris paribus, that tends to shift the supply function back, as it would here. If we shift the aggregate supply function to the level we'll call AS2, a new equilibrium position, in this case at a lower level of output, GDP2, and a higher price level, PL2. Now, when we talk about this in reality, keep in mind we're using our ceteris paribus assumption here. We're assuming that everything else is held constant and the demand function isn't shifting. It's not necessarily the case that when we get cost push inflation, it will result in a recession where output falls, because our demand function is probably shifting out as well. But we're isolating and focusing on those things that would cause the price level to rise related to cost push inflation. and that is what would shift the aggregate supply function back to a level such as AS2. Our supply shock variant we discussed last time, and we were starting our discussion of the wage push variant, and in doing so, had started to talk about productivity, which is real GDP per hour of labor. Per hour of labor. And we were talking about this at the end of class, that when we look at productivity, we're not talking about trying to get more work out of employees by making them work harder, pushing them more, blood out of a stone, whatever. What we are talking about in terms of productivity gains is when we enable workers to produce more per hour because of technological innovation. I gave the example of digging a ditch with a shovel versus digging a ditch with a backhoe. You're going to be more productive if you have the better capital to work with. Your output per hour is going to go up. Somebody performing transcription services with a typewriter versus doing it with word processing, with WordPerfect or Microsoft Word. When we do that, what we have is the opportunity once again to expand the production per hour of workers by enabling them to keep texting in class up and back with your hand on your forehead. Shut the thing off. I didn't say it. I said, all right. So when we talk about expanding the level of output, the best way that we can do this with an increase in the standard of living is to watch productivity rise. This is key. And what I said at the end of class is that if your output per hour goes up by 10%, you're producing more output, increasing what you're producing by 10% per hour, and your wage rate goes up by 10%, your costs associated with your productive activities has not changed, because yes, you're getting a wage increase commensurate with the gain in your productivity. So when we talk about what happens in the economy and what happens with respect to the level of inflation, where we get into a problem is where wage increases in percentage terms exceed any increase in productivity. If you get a 10% increase in your wage and you're producing exactly the same amount, what's going to happen, ceteris paribus, to the cost of what you're producing? It's going to go up, okay? You get paid 10% more, you're producing the same, you're going to have a situation where your costs of production and your cost of the product are going to rise. So when we talk about this in terms of the wage price, wage price, that should be. The wage push variance is right. We talk about something called the wage price spiral historically. That when we see increases in wages that exceed any gains in productivity, that's going to cause prices to go up. So suppose you're a worker and you see that you want to get a raise, and your union that you're working for negotiates a wage increase, no change in your output, but your wage goes up by 10%. That's going to increase the cost of production by 10%, and most likely will cause prices to go up. So now you look at it and you say, well, I got that 10% raise, but now, and I'm exaggerating, prices go up 10%, I'm not any better off. So now I'm going to ask for another wage increase. And if again there's no increase in productivity commensurate with it, we get the spiraling up of wages and prices. So what we would prefer to see is a situation where wage increases are commensurate with productivity gains. And that's why productivity is so important. I know there was a hand up here before. Yes?
I was going to ask what the definition of wage price spiral would be.
I don't think I have an actual definition. I'm referring to simply as prices increase and wages increase in the same fashion, you're going to get that continual upward trend in wages and prices. They spiral together upwards. One of the most important statistics that comes out on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis actually, is productivity data. And it gets very little attention in the media. Tomorrow morning, just by coincidence, we're going to see productivity data coming out at 8:30 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And that's something economists look at very seriously, because what we want to see is that productivity gains are starting to grow again. That's the way in which we get increases in the standard of living, and pretty much the only way. When we look at what's happened over the last century and the increases in standard of living, the increases in incomes for households on average, one of the biggest driver of that, almost the only driver, is productivity gains. Because you can't really get anything else that's real in terms of actually occurring as an increase in output, and hence an increase in income and an increase in standard of living that isn't driven by the ability to produce more per hour. We're watching this tail off a bit. There's a real controversy in the economics profession right now concerning productivity and where we're headed. There's a very famous economic expert on productivity, Robert Gordon at Northwestern University. He has a book that came out about 3 or 4 months ago, and he's very pessimistic about productivity gains. Other economists are saying, well, we'll start to see them. He makes the comment, and I kind of piggyback off of this in my own opinions, that a lot of what we've seen in terms of technological innovation is things that are associated with social media. All right, and we're not really sure that that's something that's increasing our output per hour. I would make the argument, based on my experience here in the classroom, what I see in the consulting work that I do, it may be reducing output per hour. Because you gotta constantly be texting, you gotta be constantly checking on your Facebook page, and it's a productivity killer, in my opinion. And Gordon has somewhat the same attitude, that what we saw with the development of word processing 25, 30 years ago, with spreadsheet calculations that we all take for granted, with people who are sitting in class while they're supposed to be learning and looking on their computers and reading something else. What we have seen in this context is not something that's associated with increasing our level of output. It's detracting from it. Word processing, spreadsheets, other ways in which we've accelerated the ability of individuals to produce goods and services has had a very dramatic positive impact, but that's petering out. Gordon likes to make the comparison, and I think this is very interesting, that if you were to take someone, I'll take my mother who passed away a couple of years ago, almost 90 years of age, major changes in her lifetime. You can make the argument that when you look at her parents particularly, houses in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, did not have refrigeration, did not have household appliances for the most part. You had a stove, but it was not something that was electrified. When you compare households in 1900 to households in 1950, you had electricity added, indoor plumbing, central heating, okay, refrigeration, air conditioning. You look at a household in that 50-year period of time, all those things were added. Now take a look at a household today. You have more sophisticated versions of the same thing. We still have refrigeration, and it's better. But we have refrigeration, we have indoor plumbing, we have central heating, we have electricity and associated appliances. A lot of obviously more sophisticated, but not the dramatic change between 1950 and today that you saw between 1900 and 1950. Include in that air travel, okay? Major dramatic changes, radio and television, major dramatic changes. What we have seen is an enhancement of those items, but not a lot that's new, other than the internet, in terms of contact, in terms of capacity to perform services around the home. So it's a major issue as to what's going to happen with this productivity data. It also takes a long time for things to translate through. When we saw electricity come on the scene, it was used initially primarily to do things we were already doing before. Provide lighting, okay? Provide the opportunity for heating, provide the opportunity for things to run off electricity that were running off of something else. What electricity ultimately gave us the opportunity for that further down the road, 30, 40 years later, radio, television, communication systems. Those things didn't occur initially. So there's a more optimistic group of economists that are saying a lot of our computer and technology innovation in terms of information technology, a lot of that may not yet have spawned the levels of innovation that they ultimately will, things we can't conceive of at this point in time, that they may spawn and enable us to enhance our productivity down the road. A lot of controversy over this as to where the economy is headed, but really that's one of the few areas in which we can see improvements made that ultimately are not controversial and increase the standard of living of everyone. Increase output, if output goes up, revenue goes up for governments. A lot of our situations with respect to deficits and debt go away, but if that doesn't happen, they just get exacerbated, they just get made worse. Does this make any sense? Okay, I'm not being gloom and doom, I'm just saying this is where the controversy is. Add to that our economy has become much more service-based versus manufacturing-based. And in a lot of service situations, there's just so much you can do to enhance productivity. It's hard to imagine that you could get an enhanced, take the entertainment field. Are you really gonna get a productivity enhancement in a play staged on Broadway? You know? Are you gonna do Shakespeare with fewer actors? Actors playing multiple parts? Probably not. Take education. This classroom is an exception to this, but at most universities around the country, classroom size has gone down. Now take what professors are paid. If you're measuring the professor's income on the basis of his or her productivity, if you're producing fewer students per semester as a measure of your output, you're being paid more while your output is actually declining. My colleagues hate it when I say this because when we talk about the costs of higher education, I maintain that we've had all these types of technological improvements in education and we've watched class size go down. When I started here, I had 4 classes with 35 to 40 students in each class. We had no, the grading of exams was done by hand. We had, I still do because I'm old, but we also had no computer technology, no calculation of grades with spreadsheet. And what we've watched happen over time is we've had all these enhancements to making our job easier, and we've lowered the number of students that we have in a class. To me, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and that's probably why I don't say this too often in front of my colleagues. But it's, it's an issue that people don't like to address, they don't like to come to terms with. We've done the same in the healthcare field to some extent. But in any event, I'll cease this discussion now. Obviously, in my opinion, this is a very important concept. What's happening with respect to productivity really does drive the bus on a lot of things associated with our economy. Questions or comments? Then let's continue talking about some other aspects and issues associated with inflation. In fact, let me shift gears a little bit and just for a moment take this diagram structure and talk about deflation. Deflation, as we defined last time, is when the general price level, the average level of prices of goods and services declines. And as I said before, there's a tendency to think that this is a positive thing. And let's try to distinguish, as an economist by the name of Gary Schilling has done, between what we might call good deflation and bad deflation. When deflation can occur and it's a good thing, but what happens when it becomes a bad thing? And basically, it's taking the same diagram we just had up on the board, but shifting the functions differently. And let's put 2 diagrams up. What we're talking about here now is deflation. And I'm not going to go through with sources of deflation or anything of that sort, but just to address it as an issue and to get some type of an understanding as to why the economics profession worries about it. When we put our structure together for aggregate supply and aggregate demand, there are really 2 ways that deflation can occur. Aggregate supply curve AS1, aggregate demand curve AD1, initial equilibrium position, price level PL1, level of GDP, GDP1. If something happens to cause the aggregate supply function to shift out to the right, productivity gains, technological innovation, the argument is, ceteris paribus, that we could get a pretty positive result in that context. Aggregate supply shifts out to the right, we get a new equilibrium position, we would get a higher level of GDP, and a lower price level. That's the positive side. On the other hand, if we talk about deflation that comes from a decrease in aggregate demand, that's a different result. Initial aggregate supply curve AS1, aggregate demand AD1. Again, initial equilibrium position PL1, GDP1. If we get deflation that is due to a shift back in the aggregate demand function, to a level such as AD2, what we get then is a new equilibrium position at a level of GDP we'll call GDP2 and a price level PL2. So let's think about how these two function. If what happens initially is we get some major technological innovations, something that causes the aggregate supply function to shift out to a level such as AS2, good deflation, this would be good deflation, is yes, you get a higher level of output, GDP2, and you get lower prices, PL2. Here's the catch, however. Two things at least as to what happens that causes this to transform into this. Remember when we talked about price expectations when we were looking at demand and supply shifters? Do you recall this? And we said that if consumers expect prices to fall, if there's an expectation that a price of a particular good is going to be lower in 2 or 3 months, what do they do to their demand today? Increase it or decrease it? Decrease it. Because your expectation is, well, price is going to be lower, therefore, if it's going to be lower, I'm going to wait and delay my demand, my consumption. If enough people do that, that causes the demand for the product to fall. So here's the first part. If this starts to occur, this good deflation begins to occur, and price levels are falling, do you think there might be some people who will delay their purchases in anticipation of a lower price? And if they do that, that causes the aggregate demand function to shift in. And now, yes, you still get lower prices, but you also get a lower level of output. Add to it over here. If prices are falling, and we've got a situation where we've got deflation, output initially goes up when prices are falling. What's that going to do to the revenue of producers? If the prices they're getting are going down, generally speaking, that will cause their revenue to go down. If their revenue goes down, what happens to the wages that they can pay their workers? Goes down. As wages go down, what happens to the income of households? It goes down. That would contribute not to an increase in demand, but to a reduction in demand. The argument that's made by people who have some expertise in this area is that even when we initially get a positive impetus for deflation, where we get some type of shift out of the supply curve, it isn't very long before it transforms into this, where the demand function shifts in and now we start to get lower levels of output. Every period of deflation that we've had in our nation's history has been associated with recessions or depressions, because that tends to be the correlation, the connection, what ultimately begins to occur. Yes?
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, it's, are there countries that do this functionally? Like, I know China has manipulated its currency.
Well, that's a political statement. And I'm not picking on you for that, because that's become part of the common perception. China actually they had in the past, they have not for a long period of time now. Okay? The argument was that they were manipulating their currency either to cause it to rise or to fall. It's been pretty much following market trends and patterns for the last year and a half. But when we talk about would any country intentionally do this, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It may be that that's not the intent, but it is the effect. And what areas, the United States has been able to avoid this for the most part. We had, as I said, 1 year, but we live in fear of it. That's the issue, is even if this isn't something that we are concerned with occurring right now, there's a fear of it. Because the deflation in Japan has been going on for almost 2 decades. They have periods of time where they break out of it and then it kicks right back in. It's associated with periods of economic decline. And the countries that are using the euro in the Eurozone are also experiencing on and off deflation. It varies. It varies between Germany and Italy and Greece, but certainly countries with different characteristics, it does vary. But that's a very big concern in Europe, to the point where they've had negative interest rates, which we'll talk about at a later point. Yes?
That's actually kind of what I was gonna ask. Isn't that one of the reasons why Greece is struggling? Because when they changed over to the EU, their currency, they had trouble, because I know that they would be able to kind of control their prices on certain things when they have their own currency, and so it doesn't necessarily benefit them being in the EU.
Good question. It's a loaded question. There are a lot of things that have contributed to Greece's problems. But if you're focusing on the common currency, There are a lot of economists who thought that the idea of a common currency for that many different nations was just a bad idea. I'm not an expert in the area, but there's something called a theory of optimal currency areas, what you need to have in terms of, for a geographic entity to use the same currency. Europe doesn't have it. There's so many different cultural aspects that we've got a common currency, allegedly a common monetary policy, and 17, 18 different government structures. Doesn't work. And there was a one-size-fits-all sense about the euro. This will be good for everybody. It's been much better for Germany, for France, than it has been for Greece and Italy. One of the ways when nations get into serious economic crises, one of the first things that happens is the value of their currency drops. When the value of their currency drops, it makes their exports cheaper in other countries so that it helps to reinvigorate the economy. That hasn't happened for Greece because they're locked into the euro, which is wonderful for Germany and France, not so much for Greece. So this one-size-fits-all notion of having a common currency, I tend to agree with this, and it's an opinion, has been a disaster in many ways for those countries that have not been as advantaged by it. It's been a wonderful thing for Germany. It has not worked so well for Greece. And Greece has a lot of other things that contributed to its situation. But when everything was going well, it's like everything else. Oh, this is a wonderful idea. This is great. The first crisis hits, and it's like, whoa, what's that? You know, it's like everything in life. You know, it's going real well until, you know, to your car finally, after driving it for 200,000 miles, it does break down. Okay? It's in this situation in Europe right now, and we've got a lull in the action, but it will pick up again, where we start to hear about the, you know, will the euro break up? Will the eurozone be? And how do you do that? You know, it's even Great Britain dropping out of the European economy. They weren't using the euro. So their movement out of the European zone was just in terms of the trade regulations. It had nothing to do with the currency because they never adopted it. Okay, they stayed with the pound. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's a complex question which I've just barely touched on in terms of what some of the issues are. Other questions? All right. Let's wrap up this discussion of inflation with a few other comments. I was talking just a moment ago about interest rates. And when we talk about real rates of interest, it's pretty easy to define what we mean by that, but it becomes much more complex in the implementation. The Federal Reserve we're constantly hearing about what the Fed is going to do. I'll make this point clear when we get to that section of the course. The Fed does not control all interest rates in the economy. That's a common misconception. They typically target one particular rate, a very short-term rate, which we'll discuss in the third section of the course. But when we talk about interest rates, basically, the real interest rate, whatever interest rate it is that we're looking at, whatever category of rates, the real interest rate is equal to, this is no great declaration here, the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Remember, real means the value has been adjusted for the effects of inflation. Nominal tells us it is not. So when we see that adjective real, it means adjusted for the effects of inflation. Nominal means not adjusted for the effects of inflation. We define the real interest rate then as simply whatever the nominal interest rate is minus the rate of inflation. For example, right now the interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets is 0.5%, 0.50%. Most recently, our inflation rate for the last month, I believe, was 1.7%, meaning that the real rate of interest is minus 1.2%. The Federal Reserve wants interest rates to be negative in real terms, adjusted for inflation. The reason they want that is so that there's some extent to which it encourages borrowing, discourages saving. This is true in Europe as well, except the Eurozone in Europe has gone to the point where even nominal interest rates are negative. And people hear that and they think, how could that be? Well, basically it means that you've got some type of deflationary concern, or you're looking for having an asset that's secure. What it basically means is, if interest rates are negative, and let me use a larger number than they currently are, but if you had a negative 2% interest rate, that would mean if you put $100 in the bank today, next year you'd have $98. Does that sound like a good deal? No, but suppose the deflation rate was 4%. The prices of what you could buy with that $100 dropped by 4%, and you're only suffering a negative 2% interest rate. Are you better off then? Yes. This is not easy to understand. It's like telling people they can put their pants on over their head, right? People don't get this. And negative interest rates are an extremely complex thing to deal with, largely because of the perception associated with them. And it's really had an ironic effect in some of the countries in the Eurozone where the European Central Bank has been pushing this negative interest rate policy. The argument was that if you had negative rates of interest, it would do two things. It would encourage people to borrow more, and it would encourage them to save less, thinking that it would somehow stimulate the economy. You got a negative interest rate out there, you're going to save less because there's less of an incentive to do so. You have a negative interest rate, it makes borrowing real cheap. In fact, you pay back less than you borrow. If you borrow $100, you pay back $98. Sounds pretty good. The thinking was this will stimulate the economy. The data starting to come out is stunning, because what it's showing is the way households have reacted is they have saved even more. If you have a target level of savings that you want to attain, and you can't count on any interest being earned, in fact, you count on the interest being negative, what does that do to what you need to do to meet your target? You got to save more. And no one ever thought this would dominate. You know, I say in life, every time we look at a problem, in our personal lives as well, there are multiple variables. It's the size of the coefficient attached to each variable that makes the difference. And when we look at this in the context of this situation in Europe, everyone knew, okay, you could have a situation where people would save more, but it seemed to be dominated by the incentive to borrow more and save less. Well, think about it. Like in the United States, if you've got a large percentage of your population that's approaching retirement, do you think you're thinking you better have some money saved up? You have a target maybe that you're trying to hit, so you have a fund to tap in your retirement years? If you can't get to that target with any type of expectation of interest being earned, it means you're going to have to save more to achieve it. And that seems to have become a very dominant factor. We're seeing all of these policies reconsidered, perhaps incorrectly, but it has created a situation that is really remarkable in its complexity and the opposite in many instances of what would have been anticipated. And I don't want to beat this to death, but it's, you know, when we hear about this, by the way, also what people might do if you've got negative interest rates is you don't put your money in the bank and you hold it yourself, right? Are there risks associated with that?
Yeah.
What are the risks associated with it?
Mattress catches on fire.
Fire, theft, okay? All of these things. What people forget is that when you put money in the bank, you expect to get interest. But also remember, you're storing it there. If you store something somewhere, is there a storage fee?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I have to have a storage area for my business, for old files. I pay a storage fee. Well, when you've got money and you want it to be secure, you know it's going to be more secure in a bank than it's going to be in your mattress. Okay? And as a result of that, even if you're not getting any interest, you might still put it there and be willing to pay a storage fee. That storage fee is a negative interest rate. Okay? Still makes sense to hold the money in that context. Now, at some point you cross a threshold where maybe it starts not to become as worth it and you take on the risk of holding the money yourself. But these are, you know, they always say the curse is to live in interesting times. And many of you may be even too young to really remember the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, but we have been dealing with this now for almost 10 years. And these have been extraordinarily interesting times. And that is in some ways a curse as well. Questions or comments on this? The last thing I want to do in this inflation section is talk first about who benefits from inflation and who is hurt by it. So let's have a list. Who benefits from inflation? You know what, you're gonna get mad at me for this, actually, I should do the hurt. Who is hurt by first? Sorry, cross it out. Let's do who is hurt by inflation first. Number one, typically, those on fixed incomes. What we mean by a fixed income is an income that doesn't change. An income that stays the same, does not rise or fall. We used to, in the old days, think of retirees as being in this category. If you retired and you had a pension benefit or a Social Security benefit, and that benefit was going to stay the same for the entire 15, 20 years of your retirement, then you would be hurt by inflation. If your benefit was $2,000 a month, every year that prices went up, what was happening to the purchasing power of your money? Going down. So we would say that those on fixed incomes, whose incomes don't change, are hurt by inflation. We've cushioned that quite a bit, because for about 25 years now, Social Security benefits, as we've discussed, have a cost of living adjustment that are tied to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. So that every year, whatever the percentage changes in the Consumer Price Index, Social Security benefits go up by that amount. When the CPI goes down, as it did in 2009, they stay the same and do not get reduced. A lot of pension plans today, pension benefits, old-fashioned defined benefit pensions that people get from their employers, have a cost of living adjustment associated with them. So we've cushioned it a bit, but not perfectly. We still have some individuals in their retirement years who are getting some type of payments to support their retirement that stay the same from year to year, so they are hurt by inflation. Creditors are hurt by inflation. Those who loan money. Creditors are those who loan money. They are hurt by inflation in the following sense. Let's forget about interest for a moment and just look at loaning money to someone. If you loan $10,000 to a borrower and you give that to the borrower today, and inflation over the next year is 10%, and the borrower gives you back the $10,000 a year from now, the purchasing power of that $10,000 that you get back is less than what it was when you loaned it. Make sense? That you gave it to the person at the beginning of the year, they could go out and do whatever they wanted to with it. When they pay you back at the end of the year, and I'm simplifying here, if inflation has occurred, the purchasing power of that $10,000 has declined. Now, we throw interest into the picture because you pay interest on the loan. But that just changes the matrix a little bit. It doesn't change the effect. If you're a bank and you factored in a 3% interest rate, assuming that the price level would stay the same and inflation occurred, it still erodes the payments that you're getting back for the money that you loaned. You can flip this and say that also hurt by inflation are savers for the same reason. When you save money, you're turning it over to a bank. And so using the same analogy, I put $10,000 in the bank today. Over the course of the next year, prices go up 10%. The purchasing power of the money that I have saved has declined. Even if I get some interest, it just changes the matrix, the calculation, whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't change the effect. I might be getting 2% interest, but it still means that the purchasing power of what I have a year from now is eroded by the effects of inflation. Make sense? Now let's turn it around. Who benefits from inflation? creditors are hurt by it, the debtors benefit. Debtors benefit. Those who borrow money benefit because ceteris paribus, they are paying the dollars back with less purchasing power than the dollars that they receive. So when we say that inflation occurs, who's hurt by it? Creditors, yes. Who benefits? Debtors, those who borrow money. And we also say that speculators benefit. This is an old-fashioned inclusion on a list of this sort. I'm never sure it's totally valid, but the argument is that speculators are speculating that the value of something will rise. In an inflationary environment, there's more of a tendency for it to increase. As an aside, which I don't hold you responsible for, some speculators bet on the value falling. It's called short sales. Not that's a real estate term. It's called shorting a market. So you can speculate either way. But generally speaking, what's easiest for people to remember is that speculators who speculate in stocks and real estate, they're hoping that the price will rise. If the price rises during inflationary periods, ceteris paribus, the argument is they tend to benefit. Let's do the same thing for deflation. Who is hurt by it and who benefits from it? And as you might imagine, we just flipped the list. So now who benefits from deflation? It's the same as the list of who is hurt by inflation. And then over here, who is hurt by deflation? It's the list of those who benefit. So who benefits from deflation? Those on fixed incomes. If your income is constant and never changes and prices are falling, what happens to the purchasing power of your money? It goes up. If you're a creditor and you loan $10,000 today and get it paid back a year from now when deflation has occurred, the purchasing power of what you are paid back is greater than what you loaned out. Savers, you put $10,000 in the bank today, and a year from now the price level is lower, the purchasing power of your $10,000 has gone up. Turn it around, who is hurt by deflation? Debtors. You borrow $10,000 today, and when you pay it back a year from now, it's worth more than what you borrowed, not a good thing. And speculators, because the price would be falling. Just one last comment here, which you're not responsible for. But when we say who benefits from deflation and we put creditors on the list, we're listing, would be lenders, banks and other types of lenders. This is only looking at the deflation side of things. The way in which banks make money is by interest rate spreads. What they pay out to savers will be less in interest than what they receive from borrowers because they have to survive. They have to pay their expenses and earn a profit. So usually when we have deflation, creditors are confronted with extremely low interest rates. So when we look at banks in Japan, banks in Europe, they are not thriving now. Particularly in environments where prices are falling, like in Japan and in some European countries, they are not thriving because those spreads between the interest rates that they pay out and the interest rates that they receive are so small that a lot of banks are in some serious trouble because they can't meet their expenses, their spreads are too narrow. It's not a good time for those in the banking sector. Any questions? Okay. The next thing is to move on to those first, and I think we can get through it today. If not, we'll need a minute or two on Monday, is to go to those first few pages of Chapter 8. We have finished now Chapters 5, 6, and 7, and moving on to those first few pages of Chapter 8. What we are basically doing is starting this section of the course where we talk about our model for understanding the workings of the macroeconomy. And that's what we'll be doing in the third part of the course. But before we do that, we need a little bit of historical perspective, a little bit of background as to where that model that we're going to be dealing with comes from. When we talk about the aggregate expenditure model, which is what we'll be calling it, it's based upon The general theory of employment interest and money, or sometimes just called the general theory. The general theory of employment, interest, and money, written by John Maynard Keynes, published in 1936. The general theory of employment, interest, and money, or as it's sometimes just called the general theory, revolutionized economic thinking. Revolutionized it. It was a whole new way of looking at the macroeconomy. A whole new way, a whole new approach to looking at the macroeconomy. Extremely controversial when it came out, but John Maynard Keynes was probably the most successful economist internationally of his era. Was extremely successful in what we now would call classical macroeconomics. Right? He was a leader in it. But by the early to mid 1930s, he recognized something wasn't working with the traditional models. They weren't really describing what was going on in the global macroeconomy, because in the 1930s, the global macroeconomy was experiencing the Great Depression. And it was pretty clear that things weren't working. So Keynes set out to find a new way to look at the workings of the macroeconomy, a new way to describe it. A whole new model, a whole new approach. He discarded, for the most part, everything in the world that had made him successful at that stage of his life, in his 50s. Because he said, this just doesn't work. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant person, brilliant literary critic, brilliant investor, brilliant on many, many different levels. You know, it's one of those situations where you see it occasionally in history, where the historical times generate individuals who are up to the task. Not so sure we're doing that currently, but generate individuals who are up to the task. And Keynes was one of those people. This is probably the most important work in economics since Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and still to this day continues to be so. Very controversial. There was a period of time when a lot of Keynes' work in say the late 90s, early part of this new century, was refuted, was said, oh, this doesn't apply anymore. And along comes the financial crisis, and even conservative economists have said, if you want a way to understand what happened in 2007, 8, and 9, and to this day, the best place you can turn is to a recollection of the general theory of employment, interest, and money written by John Maynard Keynes. What I'd like to do, very, very simplistically, is talk about what some of the features were of classical macroeconomics, very quickly, and then talk about the way in which Keynes refuted them before we get into our discussion, in essence, of his model as we move into the third part of the course. So when we talk about principles of classical macroeconomics, I'm going to simplify quite a bit in doing this, but it's important to understand what existed before and what Keynes was in fact refuting. A lot of it was based upon the work of Adam Smith from a macroeconomic perspective, but the first, we'll call this principles of classical macroeconomics. The first principle is that there cannot be, under the conditions of classical macroeconomics, there cannot be an insufficiency. There cannot be an insufficiency of total demand for goods and services. cannot be an insufficiency of total demand for goods and services. Classical macroeconomics accepted what is called Say's law, which is in essence that supply creates its own demand. Supply creates its own demand. So there cannot be an insufficiency of total demand for goods and services, and it's based on accepting the principle of Jean-Baptiste Say, a French philosopher, that supply creates its own demand. What this means is that in essence, if we look at a country as a closed economy, that the production of goods and services generates income to those producing them. And that income for those producing the goods and services is enough money to buy the goods and services. So it's circular. The idea that, yes, when we talk about supply, that's the production of goods and services, and the argument under the classical perspective was that that production of goods and services generates income to firms, generates income to the owners of the firms, generates income to the workers, and all of that income that's generated is sufficient to buy the goods and services themselves. So the argument was in essence that it's circular, the economy is in essence functions on its own without any type of external influence. Secondly, the economy tends to operate at full capacity. The economy tends to operate at full capacity. And the only equilibrium is full employment. The only equilibrium is at full employment. So the argument that was advanced by classical macroeconomics was that supply creates its own demand. The economy tends to operate at full capacity. The only equilibrium position is full employment. That the economy will always tend to move back to the full employment position. Classical macroeconomics felt that there were corrective mechanisms that would bring this about. And those corrective mechanisms included interest rates, wages, the wage level, and the price level. Here's how classical macroeconomics felt that this would work. If we had a situation where suddenly people saved, what happens if people save? Well, then you got a problem, you got a leakage. If the production of goods and services generates income sufficient to buy those goods and services, then if there's saving that occurs, you have a problem. Saving has drained out of the system. Well, classical macroeconomics said, no, that'll be correct itself. Because if there's more saving, that will lower interest rates, ceteris paribus. Lower interest rates will generate more borrowing will stimulate the economy, and we're right back up the square, okay? Classical macroeconomics also felt that wage levels would adjust for any unemployment. If unemployment were to occur, the argument goes under classical macroeconomics, unemployment means there's a surplus of labor, prices will fall, wage rates will fall, and as wage rates fall, more workers will be hired, corrects the problem. Similarly, if there are goods and services that go unsold, prices will fall, the goods and services will be purchased, and we're right back on track. So basically, the conclusion of classical macroeconomics is there is no need for government intervention. No need for government to play a role, no need for government intervention. So basically, since there could not be an insufficiency of total demand, Say's law would apply, the economy would be at full capacity, corrective mechanisms would bring that about, like interest rates, wages, and prices, no need for government intervention. What was the phrase that Adam Smith used to characterize this? Laissez-faire. Not with respect to everything, but in terms of involvement and interference in the macroeconomy. So now let's look at the Keynesian critique of classical macroeconomics. By the mid-1930s, when the general theory was published, it was pretty clear that this wasn't working. We were already 5, 6, 7 years, depending upon when you count the start point, into the Great Depression, unemployment running in some cases 25%, output falling, prices falling, none of these corrective mechanisms supposedly working, a crisis as to whether or not there was a belief globally anymore in capitalism or the market economy. Keynes developed a new theory. We'll call this the Keynesian critique. The Keynesian critique of classical macroeconomics. First, Keynes said, the economy can be in equilibrium. The economy can be in equilibrium. At less than full employment. The economy can be in equilibrium at less than full employment. And this was pretty self-evident, pretty obvious, because after 5, 6, 7 years, we've been in some kind of equilibrium position for an extended period of time globally, and that equilibrium position was clearly at less than full employment. So this was almost self-evident that the economy could be in a position of this sort. Keynes made a very important statement about interest rates. He said that the rate of interest would not necessarily ensure full employment. The rate of interest would not necessarily ensure full employment. Keynes felt that there were other factors that were more important in influencing saving, and influencing borrowing and investment. And he felt that income was a bigger driver than interest rates. Keynes made the point, and it's certainly been true over the last 7, 8 years, Keynes made the point that you could get economic conditions where lower interest rates did not stimulate borrowing. He had a phrase he used, which we'll talk about later on. He called it the liquidity trap. And there are economists who have resurrected that terminology over the last 8, 9 years to describe what we've been going through. He basically felt that we could get in a situation where things became so pessimistic that even at low interest rates, less borrowing would occur. Even at lower rates of interest, less borrowing would occur. We would not stimulate it as would normally be the case by businesses and by households, because a level of pessimism became ingrained in the economy, in the actors and agents in the economy that overpowered the effect of interest rates. He didn't say this was true all the time, but he said there were extreme circumstances where we could get into this situation, and he gave it the name liquidity trap. And what it basically means is, again, no matter how low interest rates get, it doesn't have the stimulative effect on borrowing for businesses and households that one would normally see. And it's clearly been the case in the international economy in recent years. He also felt that wages and prices, still got a few minutes, we'll finish this. Wages and prices were not necessarily corrective mechanisms. Wait, take long if I fall down. Were not necessarily corrective mechanisms. Keynes used a phrase, a British phrase, sticky downward. That they were sticky downward. What he meant by that is much more likely to increase rather than fall. That wages and prices were not necessarily corrective mechanisms because, yes, they could go up, but there was much less of a tendency for them to drop enough to correct for the circumstances in the marketplace. And we go back and look at the data for the 1930s, and it's very interesting, because at the same time that prices were falling, where we had deflation, where the economy was slowing, was in a depression, in most years, wages did not go down. In some years, they went up because of this sticky downward notion that they're much more inclined to go up than they are inclined to go down, which limits their use as a corrective mechanism. His conclusion was, and this is important, that the government budget get the terminology right, is an important tool. For influencing demand. For influencing demand. He basically saw a role for the federal government, we still got a couple of minutes, he saw a role for the federal government in having an impact on the macroeconomy. This was already starting to happen. Just hold on here. What was the program in the United States called during the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s? The New Deal. Right? This was already starting to happen, but Keynes was basically saying it's no longer the case that laissez-faire is necessarily the best. Now, one last comment. When we look at this statement, the government budget is an important tool for influencing demand, we get a lot of blowback over the last 20, 30 years from conservative thinkers who say Keynes was an advocate of big government. No. Government budget. What are the two parts of the government budget?
Defense.
What you spend and what you take in, right? Taxes. Two things government does basically. They spend money and they collect taxes. That's the budget. It's not just increasing expenditures. It would be totally consistent with John Maynard Keynes to have big tax cuts to try to stimulate the economy, just as it would be to have increases in government spending. So this notion that Keynes was at heart a liberal leftist, not necessarily true, because he's saying not government spending, but government budget. And the budget consists not just of expenditures, but also of revenue. I'll talk about that just a little bit more next